Picture this. It's the summer of 1893, and you are standing right in the middle of Chicago.
Oh, the sensory overload would just be absolutely staggering.
Completely staggering. Like, you look in one direction, and you've got this shimmering, almost surreal promise of the world's Columbian Exposition, the famous White City.
Right.
It's this temporary utopia. You've got neoclassical buildings, electric lights illuminating the night sky, which, by the way, was the very first time most people had ever even seen electric light.
Yeah, that alone would blow your mind.
Exactly. You've got the invention of the Ferris wheel and just this whole atmosphere of limitless human progress. But then
You step just outside those pristine gates.
right, and you are just hit in the face with the reality of a rapidly expanding late 19th century industrial metropolis.
Because Chicago was really a city defined by its extremes back then. I mean, you had the choking soot from the coal fires, the overpowering stench of the Union stockyards.
Oh, God, the smell. Millions of animals being processed.
Literally millions. And the deafening roar of the new elevated trains overhead. Plus, you have this completely unprecedented influx of humanity. We're talking about 27 million tourists.
27 million.
Flooding into a city that was already practically bursting at the seams with immigrants and rural Americans seeking factory work.
Try to wrap your head around that scale for a second. 27 million people coming and going in a world before the internet.
Before Social Security numbers.
Before photo ID. And in that chaos, right, in that vast sea of anonymous faces looking for cheap lodging, looking for a job, looking for a completely new life, you have the absolute perfect camouflage for a predator.
It's the ultimate environment for someone who thrives on disruption and anonymity. I mean, when everyone is a stranger, no one notices when the stranger disappears.
Exactly. And that brings us to the mission of our deep dive today, because we are unpacking the story of a man you have almost certainly heard of, probably in hushed campfire story tones. H.H. Holmes.
America's supposed first serial killer?
Suppose being the key word there. Famously, or infamously, dubbed the Devil in the White City. But today, we are not just going to recount the ghost stories.
No, we really need to put the legend on trial.
Yes. Our mission is to peel back the layers of a century of sensationalism. Was he really this diabolical, evil genius operating a massive, cartoonish murder machine right under everyone's noses? Or, was he something entirely different?
Like a deeply desperate, highly prolific con artist who used murder as a sloppy, brutal cover-up tool when his financial scheme started to collapse.
Right. It is the ultimate question of myth versus reality. And to get to the bottom of it, we're looking at a really fascinating, diverse stack of sources today.
We've got a lot to get through. We're pulling from contemporary historical archives, architectural reconstructions of his infamous building in Englewood, modern forensic journals.
Plus Adam Seltzer's incredibly exhaustive investigative book, H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil.
Which is fantastic, by the way.
It is so detailed. And we are even examining some modern pop culture artifacts today, like Reddit threads and, believe it or not, current eBay listings.
eBay stuff is just wild.
It really is. I am so ready to unpack this.
Yeah.
Because I have to admit, as a storyteller, I am naturally drawn to the hustle. I'm fascinated by the psychology of how someone actually pulls off a massive deception on a daily basis.
Oh, absolutely.
And I have always been deeply skeptical of the supervillain myths. Because real life is rarely that clean or that orchestrated or that theatrically evil. Like, a villain with a spinning blade trap is a movie character.
Right.
A villain who buries you in the basement because you figured out his check-hiding scheme. That is real life.
And that skepticism is exactly the lens we need today. Because as someone who spends my time buried in historical facts, civil court records, forensics, I can assure you that the myth of H.H. Holmes is heavily, heavily exaggerated.
It's all marketing.
Exactly. It's a product of 19th century media manipulation. However, I want to ground us right out at the gate here. While the supervillain lair might be a work of fiction, the forensic reality of what Herman Webster Mudgett, the man who would become Holmes, actually did is still profoundly dark. Yeah. We don't need a Hollywood set to find the horror here.
Okay, so let's strip away the aliases and the legends and go back to the very beginning. Before he was the boogeyman of Chicago, he was just a kid with a decidedly unimpressive name. Herman Webster Mudgett.
Born in 1861.
Right. In the small, deeply isolated farming town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire.
And his background is, in many ways, a classic study in developmental trauma and the need for control.
Right, because his home life was brutal.
It was. He was raised in a strict, devout Methodist household. His mother was described as incredibly cold and distant, using religion not as a source of comfort, but, as a rigid daily guide for punishment.
Wow.
And his father, Levi, was a heavy drinker and a severe disciplinarian who reportedly subjected the family to intense physical abuse.
So you have a child growing up in an environment defined by extreme control, pervasive fear, and a complete lack of emotional warmth. He learns early on that power is physical, and that survival means hiding your true self.
He essentially had to become a chameleon just to survive his own house.
Exactly. But then there's this one specific incident from his childhood that all the sources highlight, and it is just bizarre.
The skeleton incident.
Yes. So Herman was an incredibly smart kid, a stellar student, which unfortunately is the classic recipe for making him a target for local bullies.
Naturally.
And these older boys, trying to scare the daylights out of him, they dragged young, terrified Herman into a local doctor's office. And they physically forced him to stand face-to-face with a human anatomical skeleton.
They even made him touch the skull, right?
Yeah, supposedly placing the skeleton's cold, bony hands on his face.
I mean, the intent was to break him down, to humiliate him and traumatize him with the ultimate symbol of death.
But it completely backfired. He was initially terrified, sure. But then, according to his own later accounts, as he stood there touching the bone, the terror it vanished.
He found the whole experience intensely fascinating.
Right. He credited this horrifying bullying incident with actually curing his fear of death. It sparked this lifelong, morbid obsession with mortality and anatomy and dissection. I mean, he even started trapping and dissecting wild animals in the woods as a hobby after this.
Which is a huge red flag. But if we look closely at the psychology of that moment, the shift makes perfect sense. Think about a child who feels entirely powerless at home under an abusive father and powerless at school under bullies.
Yeah.
Suddenly, he is confronted with the ultimate symbol of human vulnerability, a dead body stripped down to its framework. But he realizes the skeleton can't hurt him. He realizes that death renders a human completely powerless.
Oh, wow.
So it neutralizes his fear and replaces it with clinical curiosity. For the first time in his life, he is the one with the power.
That makes so much sense.
Right. And that clinical detachment, that viewing of the human body as just a mechanical object to be studied and manipulated, is something he carries right into his young adulthood.
Which takes us to his time at the University of Michigan Medical School in Ann Arbor. He enrolled there around 1879. Now, he's learning actual anatomy here. He's learning chemistry. But more importantly, for the trajectory of his life, this is where he really begins his career in crime.
Yeah, but not as a murderer.
As a hustler. A very specific, macabre kind of hustler.
Well, medical school in the late 19th century was a completely different landscape than it is today. There was a constant, desperate need for cadavers for anatomical study, and the legal supply chain was virtually non-existent.
It was just a free-for-all.
Totally. The methods for procuring bodies were, let's say, morally flexible. So Holmes began personally procuring cadavers, working essentially as a resurrection man.
Which is the polite Victorian term for a grave robber.
Exactly. But he didn't just use these bodies for his own studies or sell them to the school for a modest fee. He figured out how to weaponize them for massive financial gain.
This is the part of his early life that just blows my mind. He looks at a stolen, rotting corpse, and he doesn't see a scientific tool. He sees a highly liquid asset.
The payday.
Right. So he and a partner come up with this scheme. They find a corrupt insurance agent and take out a life insurance policy on a fictitious person. Or they convince a poor family to take out a policy, name Holmes as the beneficiary, and then the family quietly leaves town.
And then comes the gruesome part.
Yeah. Then Holmes takes a stolen cadaver from the medical school, or a fresh grave. He completely disfigures the face and body.
Usually using acids or blunt force to render it totally unrecognizable.
And presents it to the insurance company, claiming it's the deceased policyholder who died in a terrible accident. He collects the payout, which could be thousands of dollars back then, and splits the cash.
What is most vital to understand here is the evolution of his criminality. He is blending his legitimate medical knowledge with an emerging, prodigious talent for deception.
He's testing the waters.
Right. He is learning the mechanics of how to manipulate large systems, how insurance companies verify claims, how legal documents are processed, and most importantly, how easily human trust can be exploited by a man wearing a doctor's coat.
It's essentially a macabre 19th century version of identity theft mixed with high-stakes insurance fraud.
Oh.
He wasn't killing anyone for bloodlust at this point. He was doing it for cold, hard cash. He found a massive loophole in the financial system,
Yeah.
and that loophole just happened to involve dead bodies.
And that distinction is the key to understanding his entire criminal career. Money, control, and the thrill of the fraud were always his primary motivators. Violence wasn't a compulsion for him.
No.
It was a tool. It was a way to tie up loose ends, silence a witness, or generate an asset, a body that he could monetize.
Wow.
And he was successful enough at these early collegiate scams that he felt untouchable. I mean, he completely abandoned his first wife, Clara Levering, and their infant son back in New Hampshire. He just took his ill-gotten gains and headed west to reinvent himself.
Right. So he bounces around a bit, runs a few small-time scams in different states, and eventually arrives in Chicago in 1886. And this is a pivotal moment, because this is where he officially sheds the baggage of Herman Webster Mudgett.
Good riddance to Herman.
Right. He drops the small-town identity, the angry creditors, the abandoned family, and he adopts the suave, distinguished alias we all know, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes.
The adoption of that specific alias is highly calculated. It's a clean break from his past, yes, but he also specifically chose a name that sounded inherently respectable, educated, and affluent.
He just sounds fancy.
Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. It commands immediate deference. Now, a lot of later myths claimed he named himself out of an obsession with Sherlock Holmes, but we have to look at the timeline.
Oh, it's not true.
No, Arthur Conan Doyle's famous detective didn't actually appear in print until a year later, in 1887. He didn't steal a fictional detective's name. He engineered a name that made people drop their guard.
Oh, that is so interesting.
Yeah.
And dropping people's guard was his ultimate superpower.
Hmm.
We really need to focus on his personality and physical presence here, because if you walked past him on the street, you wouldn't cross to the other side.
You'd probably tip your hat to him.
Exactly. He did not look or act like a monster. He wasn't some lurking, sinister figure in a dark alley. He was handsome. He was impeccably dapper, always wearing tailored suits.
He had these piercing blue eyes and a remarkably calm, polite, soft-spoken demeanor.
Right. He was incredibly charismatic. He didn't just seem like a gentleman. He seemed like a successful gentleman.
In modern psychological terms, he displayed all the classic traits of a highly functioning psychopath, particularly in his superficial charm. I mean, he could mimic empathy, sorrow, and respectability perfectly, like an actor playing a role. And he used that charm specifically to disarm people, particularly young women, and to project an aura of immense wealth and business acumen that was entirely fabricated from thin air.
Which brings us perfectly to how he exploited that charm in his personal life.
Yeah.
Because while he is busy building this respectable facade in Chicago, he is simultaneously living a remarkably complicated, deceitful personal life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, over the course of his adult life, he marries Clara Levering, whom he abandoned without a divorce.
Right.
Then he marries Myrta Belknap. Then he marries Minnie Williams. Then he marries Georgiana Yoke. And he doesn't divorce any of them.
It's unbelievable.
He just compartmentalizes these lives perfectly. He have a wife in the suburbs, a wife in the city, a wife he travels with.
It is a staggering feat of daily manipulation and logistical plate spinning, especially in an era before digital records or easy long-distance communication.
So true.
But again, look at the underlying motive. To Holmes, a wife was not a partner. A wife was another asset to be leveraged. He often used these women to fund his schemes.
He would marry them for their family's wealth?
Or, more cunningly, he would hold properties and businesses entirely in their names. That way, when his own creditors inevitably came knocking with lawsuits because he never paid for anything legally speaking, H.H. Holmes owned absolutely nothing.
That is so devious.
Myrta Belknap's family, for instance, was quite well off. He bought land and put the deeds in her name and her mother's name, specifically to create a legal firewall against his debts.
He's basically using human beings as shell corporations. Think about how brilliant and how incredibly cold that is. You aren't my wife. You're an LLC that I can hide stolen assets behind.
Exactly.
And this talent for leveraging debt, for using other people's money and trust, is what allows him to pull off his ultimate hustle, the construction of the infamous building in Englewood that the papers would later dub the Murder Castle.
Let's look at the exact mechanics of how he built that empire. Shortly after arriving in Chicago, he finds a drugstore at the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets. It's in the rapidly growing Englewood neighborhood. It's owned by a Dr. Holton, who is dying of cancer, and it's managed by his wife, Elizabeth Holton. Holmes walks in, uses that incredible charm, and gets a job as a clerk.
Just gets his foot in the door.
Right. He proves to be a hard worker, he charms the local customers, he expands the business, and eventually, after Dr. Holton passes away, Holmes buys the store from Mrs. Holton.
Now, I want to pause here immediately and bust a very persistent, very famous myth. If you read the sensationalized stories or watch some of the documentaries, they almost always claim that Holmes murdered poor Mrs. Holton to steal the pharmacy.
Oh, constantly.
That she just mysteriously vanished one day and Holmes told everyone she moved to California. But the historical sources, particularly Adam Seltzer's deep dive into the civil records, point out that she didn't vanish into an acid vat. She literally just moved away. She lived a long, normal life.
Exactly. It makes for a fantastic gothic horror opening to say he killed his first boss to steal her empire, but the reality is much more mundane, and honestly much more indicative of how he actually operated. He simply bought the business on credit, signing promissory notes that he likely intended to never fully pay off. And once he had that foothold, that legitimate business front generating daily cash flow, he looked across the street at a large vacant lot and envisioned something much, much bigger.
And this is where his talent for what financial investigators call pyramiding fraud comes into play. Listeners, imagine you want to build a massive commercial building today, but your bank account is at zero. How do you do it?
In Holmes's case, you build it entirely on a foundation of credit, lies, and constant aggressive turnover. First, he would borrow money from an investor using worthless promissory notes and his smooth talking just to buy the vacant lot.
Okay.
Then, to repay that initial loan before they sued him, he would turn around and take out a mortgage on the lot he just bought. Now he has cash again.
Just moving the get around.
Exactly. Then he would hire architects and construction crews to start building a massive mixed-use structure. Retail storefronts on the bottom, apartments on the second floor.
But he never paid the workers. This is the part that is almost comical in its audacity.
Okay.
He would hire a bricklaying crew, let them work their hearts out for a couple of weeks, and right before the day they were supposed to get their wages, he would walk onto the site, find some tiny, microscopic flaw in their work.
Throw a massive theatrical fit.
Yes. Threatened to sue them for ruining his building and fire the entire crew on the spot. Then he'd just put an ad in the paper and hire a new crew the next morning.
And this scheme served two essential, brilliant purposes for him. First, from a financial perspective, it allowed him to build a massive, complex structure with virtually zero capital because he was stealing labor.
Unbelievable.
Second, from a logistical perspective, it meant that dozens of different contractors worked on small, disjointed, confusing pieces of the building. No single person, other than Holmes himself, possessed the complete architectural blueprint in their head. The plumbers didn't know what the carpenters were doing. The bricklayers didn't understand the floor plan.
Which feeds right into the terrifying legend. People hear that and say, aha, he fired everyone constantly to keep his murder labyrinth a secret. He was building trapdoors and didn't want the police to know.
Right.
But let's pause the timeline right here. Let's look at the building itself, because this is where the myth and the reality violently collide. If you read the accounts from the 1890s press, or look at that incredibly detailed eBay puzzle I mentioned earlier, the building sounds like something out of a Saw movie.
The descriptions from the media were fantastical. They described a massive 3-story labyrinth with over 100 windowless rooms. They talked about doorways that opened to solid brick walls, staircases that led nowhere, and soundproof vaults lined with iron plates and asbestos.
And the basement. The descriptions of the basement are what gave an entire generation nightmares. They said he had greasy metal chutes connecting the upper floors directly to the cellar so he could easily drop bodies down in the dead of night.
Just sliding them down.
Yeah. Down there, he supposedly had bubbling vats of corrosive acid, pits of quicklime, bloody dissecting tables, and a 150-foot-long custom-built glass-bending furnace that he actually used as an industrial-scale crematorium to incinerate tourists.
The whole setup sounds impossible.
I mean, let's just ask this as logical human beings.
Yeah.
How did no one notice a whole building being rigged for mass murder right in the middle of a bustling, heavily populated neighborhood? There were streetcars outside. There were stores downstairs. How do you build a murder factory in plain sight?
The short factual answer is they didn't notice because that version of the building never existed.
Never existed.
No. To understand why we all believe it did, we have to look at the media landscape of 1895 when Holmes was finally caught. This was the absolute peak of yellow journalism. You have newspaper moguls like Joseph Pulitzer with the New York World and William Randolph Hearst with the New York Journal. They were locked in a vicious, highly lucrative war for circulation.
Okay, explain how that business model actually worked. Why did they care so much about a guy in Chicago?
Because newspapers in the 1890s didn't make their money primarily from polite yearly subscriptions. They made their money from daily street sales,
Mm.
driven by newsboys shouting headlines on the corner, and the advertising revenue those mass sales generated.
Right.
And what makes a guy walking to work stop and buy a paper? Panic, morbid curiosity, scandal. The editors knew that Blood and Mystery sold out editions faster than anything else.
So they basically operated like 19th century clickbait, but with no fact checkers. They just made the labyrinth up.
They heavily embellished, fabricated, and took mundane facts wildly out of context. When the police first entered the Englewood building after Holmes's arrest, they were genuinely confused. It was a bizarrely laid out structure.
Because of all the different contractors.
Exactly. But the newspapers took that genuine confusion and monetized it. For example, in August 1895, Pulitzer's paper published a completely fictional, highly detailed floor plan of the building. They literally drew arbitrary boxes and labeled them torture chamber and asphyxiation room.
You are kidding me?
There was zero architectural evidence and zero police reports to support those specific labels. It was entirely a marketing gimmick to sell papers.
Let's break down some of these specific myths, because the reality is actually just as fascinating, just less supernatural. Let's start with the World's Fair hotel concept.
Ah, yes.
The story goes that he built the third floor specifically as a hotel to lure in tourists for the 1893 Expo, and then murdered them in their sleep. But the historical sources drop a massive bombshell on this.
Yes. The hotel never actually functioned as a hotel for tourists, period. We circle back to the pyramiding fraud. Holmes added a third floor to the building in 1892. He went around to investors and suppliers telling them he was building a grand hotel for the upcoming World's Fair.
The ultimate pitch.
Right. This lie allowed him to secure massive new loans and buy huge amounts of building materials and hotel furniture on credit. But civil court records, contractor lawsuits, and contemporary accounts all prove that the third floor was never finished. It was never fully furnished, it never had plumbing hooked up, and it never opened to the public as a functioning hotel.
So there was no steady stream of wealthy tourists checking into room 204 and vanishing in the night. He was just using the idea of a hotel to get more credit.
Okay, but what about the secret windowless rooms, the bricked-up doorways? If it wasn't a maze to trap people, why was it built like a funhouse?
This brings us to a major scam he was running simultaneously, which is critical to the architecture: the furniture hustle.
Okay, how did that work?
Imagine you are a creditor. You sold Holmes 50 expensive oak beds and dressers on credit. A month goes by, no payment. You send the repo men, the replevin agents, to take the furniture back.
Right.
Holmes knew they were coming. He needed hidden, highly secure spaces to act as a stash house. When the delivery arrived, he wouldn't put the furniture in the bedrooms. He would take these heavy sofas and armoires and physically hide them in walled-up secret rooms within the building.
So when the repo men arrived, Holmes would invite them in, act incredibly polite, throw his hands up and say, "I don't know what to tell you, gentlemen, the place is completely empty." The agents would leave baffled, and Holmes would quietly sell the hidden furniture out the back door for cash to pay off a different, more pressing debt.
That is hilarious and terrible.
A janitor even testified later that he helped Holmes literally brick up a doorway to a room full of stolen furniture.
So it's the architecture of fraud. The airtight rooms and hidden walls weren't sophisticated death traps. They were just weirdly built, heavily secured storage closets.
Okay, but what about the gas jets? The story of him gassing people in their sleep from a central control panel in his bedroom is so pervasive.
We have to remember the technology of the 1890s. The entire building was lit by gaslight. Having gas lines running through the walls to fixtures in every room was completely standard architecture for the time.
Makes sense. Did Holmes perhaps leave a valve open intentionally to asphyxiate someone like Minnie Williams? It's highly possible and forensically sound. But there was no centralized, evil mastermind control panel in his bedroom designed for mass push-button extermination. That was pure pulp fiction.
And the grease chutes dropping bodies to the basement.
Again, mundane reality twisted by media. Many large commercial buildings or multi-story apartment blocks of that era had laundry chutes or ash chutes connecting the upper floors to the basement for janitorial use.
That's the normal laundry chute.
It wasn't a custom-built, greased corpse slide, no. It was a normal feature of a mixed-use building that reporters looked at through the highly biased lens of a murder investigation and just let their imaginations run wild.
So we are dismantling the supervillain lair piece by piece. It was a poorly constructed stash house for a serial fraudster.
Yeah.
And this is a massive, but we cannot swing the pendulum too far the other way and say he was just a misunderstood white-collar criminal.
Absolutely not.
Because while the labyrinth is a myth, the reality of what happened in that building is still chilling. Synthesizing the truth here, the cartoonish murder factory is a lie. But he did have an asbestos-lined vault. He did have a massive kiln that he claimed was for his side business of glass bending. And when police finally dug up that basement, they did find human bones.
Exactly. We have to separate the facility from the acts. He didn't need a labyrinth of doom to be lethal. He was a landlord and an employer. He had master keys, he had absolute access and authority.
Yeah.
If he wanted to kill a young woman who worked for him, he didn't need to push a button and drop her through a trap door. He just needed to wait until the pharmacy closed, everyone went home, overpower her in the quiet of the building, and take her down to the basement himself.
He didn't build a machine to kill people. He built a fraudulent building. And he used its dark, quiet basement as a convenient disposal site for the human beings who got in the way of his cons. It's domestic, banal violence hiding behind a facade of legitimate business.
Which is, in many ways, much more terrifying than the myth. A supervillain with a death ray is a comforting fiction because it's so unrealistic. A charismatic boss who smiles at you every day, kills you for your property deed, and buries you under his pharmacy is a very real, very human danger.
And that shifts our focus dramatically back to the timeline and to the human cost of his hustle. Because as much as we can marvel at the sheer audacity of his financial cons, he left a trail of absolute devastation. Let's look at the victims, the people who became known as the disappeared.
He was very specific in who he targeted.
He targeted a very specific demographic. Chicago in the early 1890s was flooded with young women. They were coming from small rural towns looking for independence, looking for jobs as stenographers, clerks, or typists in the big city.
Seeking a new life.
Right. They often had a little bit of saved money, they had their youth, and crucially, they were completely unmoored. They had no family in Chicago checking in on them every Sunday.
They were socially isolated. And Holmes, operating a pharmacy, a jewelry counter, and a large building with retail and apartment space, was perfectly positioned to intersect their lives.
He had something they needed.
He could offer them employment, he could offer them lodging. He became their boss, their landlord, and in many cases, their romantic partner. By doing so, he gained almost absolute control over their environment, their daily routines, and their finances.
Let's bring some of these specific tragic stories to light, because the myth often reduces them to just a body count, and we need to remember the real people. Take Julia Connor.
That is a heartbreaking one.
She actually moved into the Englewood building with her husband, Ned, who worked at Holmes's pharmacy jewelry counter. They also had a young daughter, a little 6-year-old girl named Pearl. Holmes and Julia started having an affair. Ned finds out, gets furious, quits his job, and moves away. But he leaves Julia and Pearl behind in the building.
Which leaves Julia entirely financially and emotionally dependent on Holmes. And then, around Christmas of 1891, Julia and little Pearl simply vanished.
Just gone.
When neighbors and employees asked where they went, Holmes gave a dizzying array of conflicting stories. He said she went to visit family in Iowa. He said she ran away with another man. Years later, while in prison, he finally confessed that Julia had died in a botched abortion that he had performed on her in the building.
And what happened to 6-year-old Pearl? She couldn't be left behind to ask questions or cry for her mother. Holmes later admitted to poisoning the child to cover up Julia's death. When investigators eventually excavated the cellar of the Englewood building, they found the bones of a young child buried in the dirt. It's just brutally, unspeakably cold.
Then you have the case of Emmeline Sigrand. She was a beautiful 23-year-old woman who came to work as his personal secretary in 1892. She worked for him for about 6 months. Friends noted she was starting to lose interest in his constant romantic advances and was planning to move on.
Good for her. Yeah.
By December, she was gone. Holmes told her parents back in Indiana that she had impulsively run off to Europe to get married to a man named Robert Phelps.
But the reality is far more gruesome, and it brings us right back to his medical school days. Her empty luggage trunk was eventually sent back to her family, but her body. Police later found evidence that Holmes, utilizing his anatomical training, had taken Emmeline down to the basement, stripped her flesh, articulated her skeleton, and sold it to a local medical school through an intermediary.
He didn't just murder his secretary, he monetized her remains.
And we need to explain how he did that, because it underscores his profound psychopathy. Articulating a skeleton is not something you do in an afternoon.
No, it is a grueling, visceral, highly technical process. First, he had to remove all the macroscopic tissue, the flesh, organs, and muscle. Then he would have likely used a maceration process.
What does that mean?
This involves boiling the bones in vats of chemical solutions, using harsh alkalis to break down the remaining cartilage and grease until the bone is perfectly clean.
And he's doing this in the basement while customers are upstairs buying cough syrup.
Precisely. And once the bones are clean, the labor isn't over. He had to reassemble them. He had to drill tiny holes into the human bone and thread copper or brass wire through the joints, meticulously recreating the human anatomy piece by piece.
That is sickening.
The level of clinical, emotionless detachment required to look at a woman you just worked with and then spend weeks methodically boiling and wiring her bones together to sell for a few $100s. It defies normal human comprehension. It escalated from collegiate grave robbing to localized commercial murder.
And perhaps the most complex, lucrative, and ruthless of his murders involved two sisters, Minnie and Annie Williams, in 1893. This one is pure financial predation.
It really is.
Minnie Williams was a one-time actress who moved to Chicago. Holmes had actually met her years earlier in Boston under a different alias, Harry Gordon. He reconnects with her, offers her a job as a personal stenographer, romances her, and presents himself as a wildly wealthy, brilliant businessman.
Of course he does.
But the real attraction for Holmes wasn't romance. Minnie had inherited a very valuable piece of commercial real estate in Fort Worth, Texas, from her uncle.
The seduction was purely an acquisition strategy. He systematically persuades Minnie to transfer the deed of her Texas property to a man named Alexander Bond.
Who does not exist.
Exactly. Alexander Bond is simply another of Holmes's aliases. And in a display of sheer brazenness, Holmes himself serves as the notary public for the transaction, legally signing off on his own fraudulent transfer.
Then Minnie's younger sister, Nanny, comes to Chicago for a visit. She is thrilled for her sister. She writes this incredibly sad, hopeful letter back to her aunt saying, "Brother Harry says you need never trouble any more about me. He and sister will see to me. I hope our hard days are over."
That letter is just haunting.
It is, because shortly after that letter is mailed, Nanny and Minnie are never seen alive again. Holmes takes the Texas property deed, signs it over to an associate using another fake name, Benton T. Lyman, and walks away with a small fortune in real estate equity.
It illustrates his modus operandi perfectly. Step 1, identify an isolated target with assets. Step 2, seduction and the establishment of total trust. Step 3, financial extraction through legal manipulation.
And step 4.
Step 4, physical elimination to prevent the fraud from ever being reported. He viewed these women not as human beings, but as natural resources to be mined, and then discarded into a furnace or a chemical vat when they became liabilities.
But here's the reality of being a con man. Keeping all those plates spinning, dodging the angry creditors, looking for their furniture, managing the multiple wives, explaining away the missing women, fighting off the unpaid construction crews, it is impossible to sustain forever.
The house of cards had to fall.
By late 1893, the financial pyramid scheme starts to wobble violently. He can't keep pulling off cons in Chicago because too many people are looking for him, looking for their money or looking for their missing daughters. The heat is too high. So he abandons the Englewood building, sets fire to the top floor in a failed attempt to collect insurance money, and goes on the run.
And this transition marks the true beginning of his downfall. He leaves the relative safety and control of his custom-built environment in Chicago and tries to take his scams on the road. And in doing so, he reconnects with a longtime associate, Benjamin Pitezel.
Ben Pitezel. This guy is a tragic, fascinating figure in his own right. He was a carpenter, a petty criminal, a chronic alcoholic, and kind of Holmes's right-hand man for years.
He was very loyal to Holmes.
He built a lot of the secret rooms in the Englewood building. He knew a lot of Holmes's secrets. And together, as they are fleeing the Chicago heat, they hatch a plot that is a direct, desperate callback to Holmes's college days.
They needed a massive influx of cash. The plan was to defraud the Fidelity Mutual Life Insurance Company of $10,000, which was a staggering sum at the time.
Huge money.
They take out a policy on Pitezel's life. The scheme is relatively simple. Pitezel will set himself up in Philadelphia, pretending to be an inventor named B.F. Perry. They will stage an accidental explosion in his laboratory.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Holmes will procure a disfigured cadaver that vaguely resembles Pitezel, plant it in the wreckage, claim it's his friend, collect the $10,000 from the insurance company, and they will split the money. Peitzel's wife, Carrie, is brought in on the plot so she knows her husband isn't really dead.
But Holmes, ever the opportunist, looks at the logistics of this plan once they are in Philadelphia. Finding a cadaver that matches Peitzel's rough description, transporting a dead body safely across state lines without getting caught, faking the explosion convincingly. It's a massive amount of work.
And it carries a huge risk of discovery.
Exactly. So Holmes makes a cold, calculating pivot. Why go through the incredible hassle of faking a murder when you can just commit one?
It's the ultimate double cross. In September 1894, Holmes goes to the Philadelphia laboratory. He gets his old, loyal friend Peitzel incredibly drunk. Once Peitzel passes out, Holmes binds him, knocks him completely unconscious with chloroform, and then uses benzene to set his living body on fire,
Oh my God.
staging it to look like a horrific, accidental chemical explosion. He doesn't need to smuggle a fake body. He just uses the real one.
He literally burns his loyal partner alive, just to save himself the logistical hassle of finding a corpse. And the crazy thing is, it works, initially.
It does.
The insurance company investigates, accepts the body is B.F. Perry, a.k.a. Ben Padazzle, and pays out the $10,000 to the widow, Carrie Padazzle. Carrie, of course, still thinks the plan worked and her husband is alive and in hiding somewhere.
Poor woman.
But Holmes, true to his parasitic nature, manipulates Carrie, tells her Ben needs the money in hiding, and manages to steal most of that $10,000 payout right back from her.
It is a stunning display of boundless greed, but his greed is ultimately what trips him up and ends his career. To successfully execute this insurance scam, Holmes knew he couldn't just walk into the insurance office himself. He needed a trustworthy, crooked lawyer to help process the claims and act as a buffer. And to find that specific type of lawyer, he relied on a man he had met a few months earlier while sitting in a St. Louis jail on a minor fraud charge.
Enter Marion Hedgepeth. This guy is a famous Wild West outlaw, a literal train robber who is serving a 25-year sentence. Holmes and Hedgepeth are in jail together, and Holmes, who can't help but run his mouth, pitches the outlaw, the insurance scam idea.
Big mistake.
Huge. He promises Hedgepeth a $500 cut of the profits just for recommending a corrupt attorney on the outside. Hedgepeth gives him a name. Holmes makes bail, gets out, pulls off the Peitzel's murder, gets the $10,000, and completely ghosts Hedgepeth. He doesn't pay him the $500.
Which is perhaps the most inexplicable, arrogant blunder of Holmes's entire criminal career. He successfully cons a major insurance company out of $10,000, but he flat out refuses to pay a $500 bribe to a known, highly dangerous, well-connected outlaw.
Why would you do that?
Hedgepeth, sitting in his cell, infuriated by the disrespect and the broken promise, reads about the Pitezel accidental death in the newspapers. He puts two and two together immediately. He contacts the prison warden, and he tells them everything. He rats Holmes out to the insurance company and brings the formidable Pinkerton National Detective Agency down on Holmes's head.
It's amazing. All the elaborate trapdoors, all the fake names, all the careful asset hiding in the world. And he gets taken down because he stiffed a train robber for $500.
It is the most mundane, arrogant mistake possible.
The Pinkertons and the insurance investigators immediately swarm Philadelphia. They exhume Pitezel's body, realize from the lack of blistering in his lungs that he was dead before the fire started, meaning it wasn't an accident, it was a homicide. And they start hunting H.H. Holmes.
And this initiates one of the most harrowing, complex, and tragic manhunts of the 19th century. Because when Holmes realizes the authorities are onto him, he goes on the run. But he doesn't go alone. He takes 3 of Benjamin Pitezel's children with him. Alice, who is 15, Nellie, who is 11, and little Howard, who is 8.
This is where the story shifts from a high-stakes financial thriller into a true psychological nightmare. Remember, Holmes has completely manipulated Carrie Pitezel, the widow. He tells her Ben is still alive, that the authorities are looking for him regarding the fraud, and that it's too dangerous for the whole family to travel together.
He divides them to conquer them.
Exactly. He convinces Carrie to separate the family. Carrie takes her infant and oldest daughter and goes one way, and Holmes takes Alice, Nellie, and Howard on a zigzagging train journey across the northern United States and into Canada.
And he is playing this incredibly sadistic, controlling game of cat and mouse. He is moving the children from city to city by train, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Detroit, Toronto, often keeping Carrie Pitezel just 1 or 2 towns behind them.
That is so sick.
At times, he had the mother and the children staying in the same city, just blocks apart in different hotels, without either knowing the other was there.
It is pure psychological torture for Carrie. And the children are terrified. Carrie keeps receiving these increasingly desperate, heartbreaking letters from Alice and Ellie, asking why they can't see their mother, why Mr. Holmes won't let them go outside.
But of course, Holmes intercepts those letters.
He never mails them to Carrie. He just keeps moving these kids, knowing full well that they are massive liabilities. They are witnesses to the fact that he is alive, and more importantly, they know he was with their father right before he died.
Which brings us to the absolute hero of this dark saga, Detective Frank Geyer of the Philadelphia Police Department. The Pinkertons eventually catch up with Holmes in Boston in November 1894 and arrest him, ironically, on an outstanding warrant for horse theft in Texas.
A horse theft warrant.
Yeah, Holmes is in custody, and he is spinning wild webs of lies. He tells police Ben Petitzel is in South America. Then he changes his story and says Ben is dead, but it was a suicide and Holmes just found the body. He says the 3 children are safe with Minnie Williams in London. It's a constant, exhausting stream of misdirection.
But Detective Geyer is not buying a single word of it. In the summer of 1895, Geyer sets out to retrace Holmes's exact steps across the country to find these 3 missing children. And we really need to pause and appreciate Geyer's methodology here, because it is incredible 19th century detective work.
It's unparalleled.
Imagine being handed this case. You have a suspect who lies as easily as he breathes. You have no national databases. You have no wiretaps. You have no credit card pings. You are Frank Geyer, and you are just standing there with a handful of photographs of a man and 3 kids. Where do you even start?
Start by walking. Geyer literally retraced Holmes's steps by going door to door across North America. He tracked them to Cincinnati. How? By walking into every single real estate office and hotel in the city, showing them a picture of Holmes and asking, "Did you rent to this man?"
That must have taken forever.
When he found a lead, he followed it. He tracked them to Indianapolis, then to Detroit, and finally across the border to Toronto, Canada. It was painstaking, exhausting, shoe-leather detective work.
And in Toronto, Geyer finally gets a break. He finds a landlord who remembers Holmes using a fake name, of course renting a house on St. Vincent Street. But the landlord notes something strange. Holmes hadn't actually lived there. He had only borrowed a large shovel from a neighbor and asked permission to dig a hole in the cellar, claiming he needed to build a storage pit for potatoes.
Geyer goes into that Toronto cellar. He notices a soft patch of freshly turned earth. They grab shovels and start digging. And the quotes from Geyer's own diary are absolutely chilling. He wrote, "The deeper we dug, the more horrible the odor became." At 3 feet deep, their shovels hit wood. They uncover a large trunk. And inside that trunk are the naked, highly decomposed bodies of Alice and Ellie Petitzel. They had been buried in a shallow grave in the basement.
It's devastating. After all those miles, he finds them.
The forensic assumption, based on the lack of blunt force trauma or bullet wounds, is that Holmes likely lured or forced the girls inside the large trunk, locked it, and then flooded it with gas from a lamp valve, asphyxiating them before burying them in the dirt. It was a cold, calculated, mechanical disposal.
But the tragedy isn't over, because Geyer still hasn't found the youngest boy, Howard.
Right, because Holmes had separated the boy from his sisters earlier in the trip. So Geyer refuses to quit. He goes back to the United States. He goes back to Indianapolis, specifically the quiet suburb of Irvington where he knew Holmes had spent time. He finds another house Holmes had briefly rented, and he interviews the local neighbors who report seeing this strange man arrive with a massive, incredibly heavy iron stove.
And this is where the physical forensic evidence truly seals Holmes' fate. Geyer searches the Irvington house. He finds the heavy iron stove abandoned there. And inside the chimney pipe and the ash pan at the bottom, investigators sift through the soot and discover charred scraps of clothing.
A melted tin spinning top that Carrie Petitzel identified as belonging to Howard.
And most damning of all, pieces of charred human bone and a child's teeth. Holmes had poisoned or suffocated the boy, chopped up his body to fit, and incinerated him in the stove.
It is utterly horrific, but I want to pause the narrative here and emphasize what you just detailed because it is vital to the core mission of our deep dive today. It was this physical forensic evidence, the bodies buried in Toronto, the teeth found in Indianapolis, the autopsy of Ben Petitzel proving murder in Philadelphia that actually brought Holmes down.
Right.
It wasn't a trapdoor in Chicago. It wasn't a labyrinth. It was shoe-leather detective work tracing his clumsy, desperate attempts to dispose of a family he had scammed.
It's exactly right. The trial took place in Philadelphia, and legally, it focused solely on the murder of Benjamin Petitzel. The evidence of the children's murders was brought in to establish his character, his flight, and his motives. Despite Holmes attempting to represent himself in court, putting on a very articulate, arrogant, and highly manipulative defense, the physical evidence gathered by Geyer and the Pinkertons was simply overwhelming.
He couldn't talk his way out of the teeth in the stove.
He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by hanging, which leads to his execution on May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. And even his death is gruesome. He steps up to the gallows, calm as ever, but when they drop him, his neck didn't snap. The fall wasn't calculated correctly. He strangled at the end of the rope for over 15 agonizing minutes before the prison doctors finally pronounced him dead.
And in a final twist of deep psychological irony, Holmes, in his last days, was absolutely terrified of what would happen to his body after he died. Think about it. This is a man who made his living stealing cadavers, dissecting his victims, stripping their flesh, and selling their skeletons.
Right, he knew exactly what was out there.
He knew exactly what grave robbers and ambitious medical students did to the dead in the 1890s.
So what does the ultimate con man do? He uses the thousands of dollars he made from selling his sensationalized fake confessions to the Hearst newspapers to pay for a highly secure custom burial. He requests that his pine coffin be placed in a deeper-than-normal grave and then completely encased in 10 feet of solid, poured cement to prevent anyone from digging him up and dissecting him.
Which is incredibly ironic, but it inadvertently created a modern forensic opportunity. Because for over a century, rumors and conspiracy theories persisted that Holmes, the ultimate trickster, had bribed the prison guards, placed a cadaver in the noose, and escaped to South America to live out his days in luxury.
Because we love a supervillain myth, we want to believe the mastermind got away. But in 2017, his descendants decided they wanted to put those rumors to rest once and for all. They petitioned the courts to have the grave exhumed.
An anthropologist from the University of Pennsylvania, led by Janet Monge, went in.
They used ground-penetrating radar, dug through that 10 feet of solid concrete, and opened the coffin. And because the cement had essentially sealed the coffin from the elements and prevented normal oxygen flow, his body hadn't decomposed normally. It was a forensic time capsule. His clothes were almost perfectly preserved. Even his trademark dapper mustache was still intact.
It's amazing. They were able to extract DNA from the remains and compare his dental records with the 19th century charts. The scientific results were absolute and conclusive. It was definitively Herman Webster Mudgett in that grave. The conspiracy theories were dead. The master manipulator had not escaped the hangman after all.
Okay, so we've established the reality of his crimes. We know how he died. But as we move into the final segment of our deep dive, we have to look at his legacy, and specifically his pop culture impact. Because despite everything we just unpacked, the messy insurance frauds, the desperate road trip, the forensic truth, he is still widely, culturally known as America's first serial killer.
It's a title that requires a massive amount of historical caveats. Was he the first person in American history to kill multiple people on separate occasions? Absolutely not. Serial murder, unfortunately, has existed as long as humanity has existed.
Right.
What Holmes represents is the first documented, heavily publicized, and media sensationalized serial killer in the modern American consciousness. He arrived at the exact moment that national newspaper syndicates, the Telegraph, and yellow journalism were peaking.
Right. He was America's Jack the Ripper in terms of generating a national media frenzy. And the legendary body count is a huge part of that mythos. How many people did he actually kill? Because if you look online, the numbers are all over the place. Some reports confidently say 200 victims. Holmes himself famously confessed to 27 murders while sitting in prison, awaiting execution.
But we have to remember the context of that confession. Holmes was paid $7,500 by the Hearst newspaper empire for his story. That's well over $100,000 today. He was a con man to the very end. He knew what the papers wanted, and he gave them the gory, highly exaggerated story they paid for.
Of course.
He confessed to killing 27 people, but investigators quickly realized that several of the people he named in his confession were still alive and living completely normal lives in other cities.
He was literally making up victims to pad his stats and guarantee his payday. That is wild.
Most modern historians and forensic researchers, like Adam Seltzer, who have meticulously combed through the missing persons reports and court documents, place the number of confirmed, verifiable victims at around 9.
9.
Julia and Pearl Connor, Emmeline Segran, Minnie and Nanny Williams, Benjamin Petersel, and the 3 Petetzl children. There are a few others who disappeared and might be connected to him, but 9 is the solid forensic baseline.
Let's be clear, 9 murders is still horrific. It makes him a monster. It makes him a prolific killer. But it's a far cry from the 200 tourists falling through trapdoors in a murder factory. Yet the 200 number is the one that sticks in the public imagination. We have this profound, enduring modern fascination with him. From Eric Larson's massively successful book, The Devil in the White City, to countless documentaries, to the constant "Today I Learned" threads on Reddit that just endlessly repeat the 1895 yellow journalism myths as absolute historical fact.
Our cultural memory has firmly, stubbornly embraced the myth over the reality.
I found the strangest detail in our sources regarding this phenomenon. You can literally go on eBay right now, today, and buy a 1,000-piece, beautifully illustrated, macabre cutaway art puzzle of the murder castle. It shows the acid vats, the stretching racks, the secret trapdoors. It's merchandise. We have turned a 19th century fraudster and child killer into a spooky, fun pop culture icon right up there with Dracula or Frankenstein.
And that reflects a deep, somewhat disturbing psychological preference in our society. Think about it. Why do we prefer the myth of the evil genius? Perhaps because the idea of a brilliant, sophisticated supervillain operating a mastermind labyrinth is somehow more digestible. It feels safely relegated to the realm of fiction, comic books, and movies. It's distant from our everyday lives.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
The reality is far more unsettling. The reality is that a banal, greedy, everyday con man can look you in the eye, charm you, offer you a job, marry you, and then bludgeon you to death in a dusty basement simply to cash a forged check. The myth makes him a supernatural monster. The reality makes him a human being who sat next to people on the streetcar, and that proximity to normal human greed is far more terrifying to accept.
Wow. That is,
Oh,
yeah, that hits hard. The mastermind monster in a castle is easier to process than the greedy, smiling boss in the pharmacy downstairs. So let's wrap this up. Thank you to you, the listener, for joining us on this really dark, complex, and fascinating deep dive. We set out today to untangle the messy, horrific, and highly exaggerated web of H. Holmes. And what we found is that he wasn't the devil operating a supernatural murder machine. He was a deeply flawed, incredibly greedy human being who ruthlessly exploited the anonymity, the lack of communication, and the rapid, chaotic changes of a growing America. He was, at his core, a lethal hustler.
but before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've discussed today regarding how he operated. Holmes's entire string of crimes, the bigamy, the insurance fraud, the contractor scams, the murders, the cross-country evasion, relied entirely on the technological and social chaos of the 1890s.
Right, the era.
It was an era where a person could simply board a train, move to a new city, change their name, and disappear without a trace. There were no national fingerprint databases, no photo IDs, no centralized credit checks.
So the question to ask yourself is this. If H. Holmes were alive today, in our modern era of permanent digital footprints, ubiquitous security cameras on every doorbell, smartphone GPS tracking, and advanced DNA forensics, could a manipulator of his caliber still find a way to operate in the shadows? Would his immense charm and psychopathy be enough to overcome the modern surveillance state? Or was the nightmare of the murder castle, even the real, scaled-down financial fraud version of it, something that could only ever exist in the soot, the anonymity, and the smoke of the Gilded Age?
It's a chilling thought.
It really is. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us. Until next time, keep questioning the stories you hear.